Welcome to the Promoting Equitable Outcomes with Inclusive Practices session. I'm Dr. Mary Ann Dewan, and I'm the County Superintendent for the County of Santa Clara.
Hello, my name is Anna Marie Villalobos, Dr. Villalobos, and I am currently working as a consultant with the Santa Clara County Office of Education. And in addition to that, I am an adjunct at the Santa Clara County Office of Education, and I teach coursework for teachers and for administrators.
I'm just delighted to have Dr. Villalobos with me today as co-presenter for this session, and just really delighted to be a part of the Inclusion Collaborative Fall Conference. We're going to address a number of outcomes today, so we'll go to the next slide. And with our goals for today's session, we really want to help our participants understand the important relationship between equity and inclusion. How essential it is that when we talk about equity, that we are also talking about inclusion in the same way and at the same time. We're going to lift up for all of our participants today how important inclusive practices are and ensure that we're able to describe how those practices can be used to promote equity and inclusion in all settings. We're also going to provide some frameworks of inclusive practices, and again, with the goal of promoting equity for all of our students. And we're going to learn about embedding inclusive practices and program development within the existing state-required planning and reporting protocols, such as LCAP and other plans that schools and school districts may be working on. To anchor us today for this session, we wanted to start with the definition of equity and ask all of you to hold this definition in the forefront as you're participating in our session. The definition we're using today is that equity is when every student has what they need to succeed, and that true equity occurs when there is a focus on inclusion. The National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity provides some resources to support this definition and this framework of equity, and the website is listed here on the slide at www.napequity.org. In the United States, 1 in 5 students have learning and attention issues, and this includes those who have been identified with specific learning disabilities, have been diagnosed with ADHD or related disorders that impact their learning. Despite often having above average or average intelligence, the majority of students in this category are achieving below grade level. And this equates to millions of students across the nation whose strengths and potential are going untapped. Our education system is systematically failing the 1 in 5 students. What we want to do is help educators unlock the power of students and how they learn differently. It's important to hear from our young people. So we're going to next share a video called Voices of Inclusion, so we can hear from our young people who participate in special education programs and the impact that it has on them.
I am more comfortable in my classroom with friends that make me feel normal. I want to be around friends I can trust.
It would be nice to have a pal set up in classes like culinary arts because I feel better about making mistakes and front of people that like me.
I need teachers that understand me, help me work out my problems, and help me get back on track.
Classes like job readiness makes me feel good about myself because I can focus and stay on task, so I get a job someday.
And I also joined Sparkle Cheerleading, and I was a captain for it for this year. And Sparkle was a great game to be in. Hey, I'm going to go on to the University of Iowa next year, and I'm really excited and I hope that it works out.
And I have learned really hard to become smarter, and I like to be and to be here with my friends and my teachers, and I really love it to be here.
ITVS is really hard. It makes me feel, can I say the word? Stupid. It makes everyone feel that way. My friends Tyler, Morgan, anyone out there that could help us, please. It's hard on everyone, and it's hard on us to do things that we can do.
It's so inspiring to hear from our young people and to really understand from their perspective how they're experiencing school. As we continue our discussion today, it's important to anchor ourselves in the data that can underpin our commitment to equity and inclusion. We're sharing some data here about placements and least restrictive environment for students with disabilities in California. There are about 12% of California students have been identified with a disability. And in 2019, students with disabilities scored on average 88 points and 119 points below standard on English and math assessments. So 88 points below standard in English and 119 points below standard in math. It's quite concerning. And then when you recognize that more than 90% of students with a disability can keep pace academically with their peers when they receive the appropriate instructional program and accommodations, the supports that they need to be well educated, they can achieve on pace with their peers. However, in California, only about 53% of students with disabilities spend time in the general education classroom. And you can see it in the pie chart here, how that is divided up by the categories of student disability. California also ranks very poorly compared to other states in the nation in terms of participation in the least restrictive environment. States that have increased their inclusion rates over the last decade have seen parallel increases in academic achievement for students with disabilities. We know it works. The more time a young person is able to spend in the general education setting and with their peers, the better their achievement is. And we believe the better it is for all students in the classroom. This past legislative session, we worked with Senator Dave Cortese to advance Senate Bill 692, which would provide additional supports and incentives to help schools and school districts create the programs, professional development, and opportunities that could advance more inclusive practices in school settings. This bill is continuing to move and will be a 2-year bill addressed again in this upcoming legislative session. When we look at the data in this California's accountability system, we observe that students with disabilities make up a group of students on the dashboard, and the same group of students also are members of many other groups on the dashboard. So, for example, students with disabilities in Santa Clara County are about 28,409 students. And these students are also a part of the local control funding formula data. They also show up in our socially disadvantaged student group. 416 of them are also homeless, and 10,533 of the students with a disability in Santa Clara County are also English language learners, and 201 are also foster youth. Since our students with disabilities are present in a variety of student groups and have intersectionality amongst these different categories that we use to serve students and secure funding, it is more important than ever that we consider a universal approach in our educational system. We can't have a separate system of special education, a separate system for English language learners, a separate system for students who are foster youth or experiencing housing insecurity. We need one universal approach to our educational system that can meet the needs of students where they are and despite the label that they may have. Next slide. According to the Othering and Belonging Institute in Berkeley, targeted universalism is a concept that means setting universal goals pursued by targeted processes to achieve these goals. Within a targeted universalism framework, universal goals are established for all groups concerned. The strategies developed to achieve these goals are targeted. They're based upon how different groups are situated within structures, culture, and across geographies to obtain the universal goal. Targeted universalism is goal-oriented, and the processes are directed in service of the explicit universal goal. And we set goals for all of our students. But what are the real expectations for students to achieve those goals if they are students with disabilities, students of color, or students on the margins? So when we set those goals, we need to be mindful of the unique needs of these various student groups. In the Ways to the Equity Playbook, we discuss a number of ways to use the framework of targeted universalism to achieve equitable and inclusive outcomes. The playbook focuses on using 3 strategies: universal design for learning, culturally relevant pedagogy, and social emotional learning as vehicles to create an inclusive environment to achieve universal goals. Now let's watch a short video that defines and describes targeted universalism.
What is the most effective and sustainable policy response to problems in our society? Universal approaches are widely used in order to package policies for broad appeal. Universal policies such as Social Security and minimum wage provide the same benefits or minimum protections to everyone, regardless of status or group membership. But by treating everyone the same, universal approaches can't root out group-based discrimination and may actually deepen inequality between groups rather than reduce it. And by providing benefits or protections to everyone, resources that could be targeted to groups worse off instead flow to those who are better off. In contrast to universalism, targeted approaches are commonly used. Targeted policies provide benefits or protections based on group membership or status. SNAP, the food stamp program, conditions benefits on income level. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires public accessibility for disabled groups. And affirmative action focuses on historically disadvantaged groups. Targeted approaches are vulnerable to the critique that they unfairly favor constituent groups over the public good by directing resources to marginalized groups who are already subjected to unfair stereotypes. But universal and targeted approaches are false choices. There is a third way, targeted universalism. Targeted universalism means setting universal goals that can be achieved through targeted approaches. This approach targets the various needs of each group while reminding us that we are all part of the same social fabric. This can be accomplished by following 5 steps. First, set a universal goal. For example, 100% proficiency in 8th grade math. Second, measure how the overall population fares relative to the universal goal. In this example, we might discover that only 80% of 8th graders are proficient in 8th grade math. Third, measure the performance of population segments relative to the universal goal. So although 80% of all 8th graders are proficient, we might find that only 70% of Latinx students are proficient. Fourth, understand how structures and other factors support or impede groups' progress toward the universal goal. For our Latinx students, classroom instruction materials and lessons designed for English speakers may impede learning, including math proficiency. Finally, implement targeted strategies so that each and every group can achieve the universal goal based upon their needs and circumstances. This may take the form of ESL-specific math tutoring for our Latinx students, while another group may require a completely different strategy to achieve the same universal goal. Targeted universalism rejects a blanket universal, which may be indifferent to the reality that different groups are situated differently relative to the institutions and resources of society. By aspiring toward shared universal goals, targeted universalism empowers targeted strategies capable of achieving those goals while moving us beyond concerns over disparities alone and toward our highest aspirations for all.
So as we think about and continue our work with today's session, you've heard about equity and inclusion. You've received some data and information to provide the why we need to do this work together. And you've learned about the framework of targeted universalism. To lift this up in day-to-day practice, we need to understand more about how we can promote equity through inclusive practices. I'd like to next hand our presentation over to Dr. Villalobos.
One of the first steps that LEAs, thank you, Dr. Dewan. And one of the first steps that LEAs, sites, and classrooms can take is to develop a culture of inclusion and belonging. A school culture that accepts all students as all of our students and builds on policies and practices that supports the inclusion of all students in educational settings as learners who belong and are not added to a learning environment, but are a member, the same as everyone else in the environment, in the classroom, makes all the difference in how inclusive practices really work. So the question really is, how do we support students with disabilities? The Ways to Equity Playbook takes a systemic and a systems approach to advancing equity. What we are intending to show in this diagram is how these major areas of work that are highlighted in the playbook exist along a trajectory of continuous improvement. We designed the playbook as a continuous improvement approach to doing equity work. And as Dr. Dewan said, so many of our students overlap in so many areas. This universal targeted approach is essential to that. So specific content areas such as universal design for learning, social-emotional learning, and culturally relevant pedagogy really comprise about a quarter of the Ways to Equity playbook. These are the universally targeted frameworks that can support not just students with disabilities, but all students. So you get essentially a bigger bang for your buck One of the frameworks that we can use is culturally relevant pedagogy, or CRP. Some people refer to it as culturally responsive pedagogy or culturally sustaining pedagogy. They're similar, but there are some differences. But for right now, I'll use the CRP when I talk about this. So we want to think about the intersectionality slide once again, and how many of our students fall into more than one group. When thinking about students with disabilities, we must examine their intersectionality with other student groups. Culturally relevant pedagogy, or CRP, can really help teachers to create a bridge between the identities and communities in which the students belong, while simultaneously meeting learning objectives and meeting expectations in the classroom. Though the terminology and meaning of culturally relevant pedagogy has evolved over the past decade and is sometimes used synonymously, as I stated before, with culturally responsive or culturally sustaining pedagogy, each of these frameworks and approaches have proven effective and should be incorporated into the classroom. And really, they should be incorporated into teacher education programs so that we are preparing our teachers and our administrators to successfully work with students of color. In her book, Lattison's Billings emphasizes that students must experience academic success, develop and or maintain cultural competence, and develop a critical consciousness in which they challenge the status quo of the current social order. So effective training is required, excuse me, for new teachers and for actually all teachers and administrators to really realize these goals and to effectively use CRP. So how can we do this? There's different ways. Culturally relevant pedagogy means embracing the cultural, historical knowledge and experience of students to inform the teacher's classroom and methodology. The Ways to Equity Playbook discusses the challenges that arise in districts because of the teacher's interpretation or their implementation and the evaluation of culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching practices. It really discusses how it can pose barriers to successful reaching students of color and producing positive outcomes. So some of these can include that teachers and administrators, such as principals, are not always aware that they have an implicit bias. We all have implicit biases. I have implicit biases. And we all have to be aware and be reflective of what may be in our implicit biases and how that may affect our perceptions and how our relationships with our students. Teachers in districts do not address the socio-political consciousness in their definition of CRP, which is vital for effectively tackling the systemic roots of racism in American schools. And the terms relevant and responsive can easily lead to essentializing practices. So CRP, it's not just about helping a student or some students. It's about transforming the system, changing how teachers relate to students, and continuous learning. It's really about building those strong relationships. That's where all the work has to be put into to make this successful. So CRP is not to be mistaken for the implementation of superficial classroom practices, because without spending the time in cultivating and making spaces and relationships where students can express their full humanity, it will not be successful. Another strategy we can use is universal design for learning. This is a framework to improve and maximize teaching and learning for all students, for all people, actually. It's an instructional methodology that focuses on designing for students at the margins and removing barriers to learning and removing barriers to instruction. It has a focus on providing multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of expression within instruction. So universal design for learning basically removes the barriers to learning by proactively and intentionally planning curriculum so that all students can have success. The difference between differentiation and UDL, universal design for learning, is the difference between, I like to say, designing a house with everything being built the way you need it and want it, versus living in a house during a remodel and maybe only ending up with some of what you want. And I've done both, and I really prefer to build it and not remodel. If you go to the UDL link on the bottom of this slide, it's https://udlguidelines.cast.org/. You will be able to see a copy of this chart. Once you're on the UDL website, it's really nice because then each one of these with bulleted points is actually a link, and it will take you to each of those areas, and it will give you a very in-depth description of what each one of those areas is. So it's really a great resource to use and to hold and to help you when you're planning your instruction. The UDL framework has numerous touch points that are allowed with culturally relevant pedagogy. The red circles on this slide highlight some of the touch points that honor culture and diversity within UDL. The practices very much support each other. If we look at the diagram on this slide, we can see that not only are we providing learning opportunities for students through UDL, but we are also optimizing learning when we focus on both models. So when you look at this slide, you can see the processing, validation, affirmation, and cognition are all parts of culturally relevant pedagogy. And they're placed within this framework, within this drawing graphic of how they coincide with the tenets of universal design for learning, varying the means of action and expression, varying the means of representation, and varying the means of engagement. There's a lot of overlap. This is another representation. It's basically a crosswalk so that we have an understanding of how UDL and CRP line up. If you notice, student voice and choice and effective feedback and monitoring are the foundation, and they are also the top of what we really do want in both of these frameworks. So in UDL, we're looking at multiple means of engagement, which really aligns with the affirming and validating in culturally relevant pedagogy. Because in culturally relevant pedagogy, it specifically says that if you don't affirm who the student is, and you don't validate where they come from and the knowledge that they have and the assets, and you don't use that as a mean of engagement, then you're really not going to be getting the type of relationship you need. Multiple means of representation goes along with the cognition portion and culturally relevant pedagogy, and multiple means of action expression goes along with the processing part, and using multiple processes for students to learn, whether it be rhythm, whether it be singing, whether it be chanting, whether it be using poems or whatever it is for students to express themselves. In the Ways to Equity Playbook, we have a section on social emotional learning with resources from the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, also known as CASEL. In the playbook, we specifically focus on the transformative SEL, or culturally responsive SEL, in the importance of SEL for adults. We like to say, if the tank is empty, you cannot drive the car. So we need to take care of ourselves also as adults. And the other thing that I would like to talk about is that if you look at the CASA website and you look at the CDE website on social emotional learning, the stress really right now is on that TSEL, that transformative social emotional learning, and there's a lot of resources there. So social emotional learning, TSEL, can't be implemented in the vacuum. It practices much take into account that children come from diverse cultures, have lived through different experiences, and express a range of assets, and not all of which are necessarily valued by our school system. Because SEL operates on a relational level, and relationships are expressed in varying ways across different cultures, it is possible that well-intentioned SEL practices result in inadvertently alienating some students. So we really must be aware of that and really take a focus in on the culture of our students and take a transformative or culturally responsive approach to SEL to address this problem by including and engaging students in the co-construction of respectful relationships. We always talk about as adults that we don't like things being done to us, that we like to do things together. Well, it's the same thing for our students, and we need to respect that, and that the importance of that co-construction, because meaningful relationships are developed when people are involved, when they're listened to, when their cultures, their experiences, their knowledge is valued. In addition, and importantly, transformative SEL builds meaningful relationships so that young people see themselves as powerful agents in changing the inequitable systems in which we all live. In writing about transformational SEL, Yagas, Rivas, Drake, and Williams state, for SEL to adequately serve those who are underserved in underserved communities and promote the optimal developmental outcomes for all children, youth, and adults, it must cultivate in them the knowledge, attitudes, and skills required for critical examination and collaborative action to address root causes of inequities. Towards this end, TSEL is aimed at educational equity, fostering the learning environments that will produce equitable outcomes for children and young people furthest from opportunity. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Dewan.
So social emotional learning is not just for students. In addition to being able to model what we teach, we do need to take good care of ourselves. There are many steps to adult social emotional learning, and the importance of these steps and how they foster classrooms, schools, and communities where whole children can thrive, where whole children feel that they belong. I often say they cannot separate health from education, and that is true, for our adults as well. We're always learning and growing. So our social emotional development continues to evolve within our classrooms and within the communities that we are working in. So as educators, we have the responsibility and the task of guiding students and promoting their social and emotional learning, and to do this with the students with whom we are so fortunate to connect. The first step, of course, for adult social emotional learning is recognizing the importance of self-care, embedding self-care practices in our day-to-day work, and having a level of self-awareness about the impact of ourselves, our words, our presence on others, and being self-aware enough to know when we need to take some steps to invest in our own self-care. When we have self-care practices and we've embedded some acknowledgement about self-awareness, we see that we're more available socially and emotionally to serve those around us. And we're more available and resilient when our children may be experiencing things that are challenging or difficult. And as a result of that increased social emotional availability, we have healthier communities. That healthier community could be the community of our classroom, the community of our team, our grade level, our school site, and ultimately our entire community. An example of some social emotional learning supports and a way for adults to invest in this work might be through the practice called conscious discipline. So maybe self-care doesn't come as naturally to all of us as we might like it to. And we can often learn from each other about ways to engage in self-care. So we're going to encourage all of our participants today to share some ideas in the chat. What self-care do you engage in to promote social emotional learning in your professional life? Some of those things can be to target how we develop our intellectual capacity, our professional skill set. Other ways may be how we nourish our body. Do we take time, for example, to have nourishing food through the school day, to have a nice hot cup of tea? Also, taking care of our spirit through a variety of practices, including sometimes just knowing when to take a deep breath and taking care of ourselves in the moment. When we include the social emotional learning as a third leg of supports, you can see from the diagram how SEL, UDL, and CRP are interrelated and inform the others' practices. By using this transformational LCL approach we've been discussing, we're using culturally responsive lenses and affirming and validating our students' and communities' experiences, and we're validating our own. The use of this lens means that educators must be aware of their own cultural experiences and lens, and must be self-aware of how their own social-emotional experiences have shaped them as human beings. This influences how we instruct our students using UDL and how we build in multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression that are meaningful and relatable to our students. And as we use SEL to build relationships and build bridges and creating positive emotional experiences for our students, we are also creating positive learning experiences that are transformational, both emotionally and cognitively. With this emotional and cognitive transformation, we have been able to create a positive, inclusive, and safe environment that supports all students in their learning. Next, we're going to spend a little time talking about how we can promote equity by building a framework of inclusive practices. One of those frameworks is the multi-tiered system of support. The state of California has invested resources in MTSS that focuses on the whole child. There are numerous resources available to support schools and districts in this work with the vision that we all share of creating one system serving the whole child. The question that we are all dealing with is how this ties into inclusive, equitable practices. Perhaps you've already invested some of your own professional learning in understanding multi-tiered systems of support. And looking at the continuum of supports, we can see that universal design for learning and differentiated instruction are integrated and implemented at all levels of the continuum of support to ensure the academic, behavioral, social-emotional, and mental health development of all students in the most inclusive and equitable learning environment. When we look at universal supports, the first tier, evidence-based practices, are accessible by all students, where the integration and implementation of universal design for learning and differentiated instruction support the academic, behavioral, social-emotional, and mental health development. For some of our students, supplemental support will be needed. Additional services are provided to some students to support their academic, behavior, social-emotional, and/or mental health through the integration and implementation of universal design for learning and differentiated instruction. These supplemental supports are provided in addition to, not in place of, the universal supports, and they're available to all students regardless of identification for specialized services based on need. And these can be identified through the use of diagnostic and progress monitoring assessments. At Tier 3, we have our intensified support. And these are more targeted supports provided to students with greater needs to support academic, behavior, social-emotional, and/or mental health through, again, that integration and implementation of universal design for learning and differentiated instruction. And these intensified supports are provided in addition to, not in place of, the universal supports. And this may be via specialized service providers. It may be through very intense instructional practices or groupings within a setting. And these could be available, again, to all students, regardless of identification, for specialized services based on their needs, using diagnostic and progress monitoring assessments. We'll turn now to Dr. Villalobos to tell us more about this.
Thank you, Dr. Dewan. So let's take a moment to look at this graphic. I think it really sums up the difference between integrating and mainstreaming or reverse mainstreaming students into a classroom versus truly including them in the class. Historically, many groups of people have been disadvantaged by their exclusion from society. I always think of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It specifically states we're going to exclude you. Looking at the diagram, we can see the various ways that different groups of people, through the process of othering, have been pushed out of the community. If we continue to use the example of individuals with disabilities, we can see from the diagram how, from a historical perspective, they were denied access to schools, to work, and to the community at large. We can also think about other groups who have similarly been excluded based on gender, race, ethnicity, religion, who have met similar barriers of exclusion and segregation. When you look at segregation, of course, I think of the Jim Crow laws. Even when you look at the diagram of integration, people can still be within the community but held in a separate group. In these three examples, the groups with the power are structuring other people's participation. They are permitting them to participate in a specified manner. True inclusion means that everyone feels they belong in the community and participate fully. They do not feel they are in a separate bubble, being allowed to participate by the larger community. Inclusion means we do not ask for permission to be. We are. We exist, and we participate as we wish. So if we think back to the videos of the students that were talking to us about special education, think about them. Were they integrated? Were they segregated? Were they fully included? What are some nuts and bolts ways that we can embed inclusive practices into our program development? So this is one example. This is an example of how to embed inclusive practices, and it's from the Forward Together report, Helping Educators Unlock the Power of Students Who Learn Differently. It supports using UDL, Culturally Relevant Pedagogy, and Social Emotional Learning, TSEL, with students with disabilities. In the report, the authors discuss 8 key practices that support students with disabilities. For example, explicit targeted instruction, universal design for learning, flexible grouping, PBIS, collaboration, CRP, and evidence-based practices. The report goes more in depth on each practice and details the supporting research. And all of these practices can be embedded into MTSS. Now, Dr. Dewan.
So as we've shared a lot of frameworks and concepts today, I think it's important to understand what the relationship of key drivers are. Some of these key drivers might be how we define or understand some of the things that are part of our vocabulary. And some of the key drivers can, when we think about them differently, drive us to that place of the one system of education that we're trying to uplift for our students. So I'm going to take each of these separately and invite you all to consider what they mean and how a shift in our relationship to these terms can drive change in our settings. So an IEP is an individualized education plan, lays out a map, setting some goals and identifying some agreements about how we believe that a student with a disability might be educated in a setting. It's a very powerful tool. It's an agreement, and some might say a contract between the school and the child. And I would like to invite everyone to consider that the true power is what happens in the classroom every day for the student with that disability. And the power of what happens every day in the classroom is really driven by the instructional practices that are occurring in the classroom every day. So when we think about this individualized plan, we want it to translate into practices in our classroom that are instructional practices that are driving learning for our students. So the key driver of student success is the instructional program. It's the instructional practices, it's the small group settings, it's the lessons that we're designing, and designing those in ways without limits. Another key driver is how we talk about special education. When a student receives an IEP, we're making sometimes decisions or having conversations about placement. Where will this student be placed? Will they be placed in a segregated setting, in a non-public school, in a special education classroom, for example? we really want to drive change and promote more inclusive practices, we should be thinking less about placement and more about services in all the places where those services can happen. We can provide more intensive services in general ed settings. We can provide more intensive services in general ed school buildings and on school campuses. And so really thinking less about the limitations that placement puts on us as an IEP team. Developing the IEP more around how we're going to provide the instructional support and additional services, and really stretching us all to provide the maximum amount of those to the maximum extent possible in a general education setting where students can be with their peers. Another key driver, and sometimes it's very limiting for us as educators and parents when we see our children as they are now versus how we believe and expect that they can aspire to be later. This really hits home for me when I think about a time when I was an elementary principal and I had a student with autism in my school setting. The student had significant autism, and I was deeply committed to inclusive practices and wanted the student, who was a member of our community, to stay with us in our school. And the student had very disruptive behaviors, also had not learned the kinds of self-care and other kinds of things that would make the student more comfortable in the general ed setting and with his peers, such as, daily hygiene or different ways of eating and using food utensils, and just some of the basic things that we might expect of all students. And when the IEP team talked about how the student, was developing in the now, the decision would have been the student needs a program that provides these daily self-care program that is more segregated, that has more supports for how the student was presenting. However, we really challenged ourselves as a team, and we said, what would it take for the student in order for him to be successful in our classroom? And who might he respond to, and who could be a role model for him? Who would he look up to so he could be more like this student that we wanted to see in the future? And through this investment and these activities, we were able to design an educational program that allowed the student to develop all of the skills that would have been taught in the segregated setting in the general education setting alongside his peers and with some key adult role models that he cared about. And within a matter of months, our student was succeeding in some very powerful ways and spending the majority of his time in the regular classroom with his peers and being able to, again, engage academically. So we were supporting his behavioral, his social emotional development, and his self-care skill development because we believed that in the later, he would be best served in that general education setting. I also think about when we're making decisions about students and whether they're going to be able to graduate from high school, and we start having these conversations when children are quite young. The decisions that we make when a child is in first grade and second grade and third grade can sometimes determine the trajectory of the student and whether or not they're going to have the access and opportunity to pursue a high school diploma. The more investments we can make in the now allow us to ensure that later our students will have the opportunity to pursue their high school diploma. So it's 3 relationship drivers that I invite all of us as educators and leaders and our parent community to consider. How are we driving instruction and instructional practices in the general education setting to support students? How much are we considering services in all the places where those services can be provided versus deciding on placements? and really envisioning where our children will be in the later and how we aspire for that beautiful vision of our children and their success as high school graduates.
These last few slides make available, give you a variety of resources, and they're all linked to different websites, different articles, different frameworks from all over the country that you can use to support you in your work of for inclusion for students. I would personally like to thank you for choosing to participate today in this session. And Marianne?
I also would like to thank you all for participating in today's session. And we look forward to hearing from you in the future about how these resources, this session, is inspiring you and the work that you're doing with students.